I think we'll make a start. There's people still coming in, but a slightly slower rate now. Okay, so hello everybody. Looks like a popular session today. As I said, we've got over 170 people registered, so we might expect maybe up to 150 people this session. So what I'll do is just as a sort of heads up for anybody who has hearing issues, if you would like to see subtitles on this, you can enable the live transcript option down at the bottom of your Zoom control panel. If you do want to do this and you have any issues, just use the chat box, and Sam, the ACB, is in the background. She will sort of help you with that. Okay, so today we've got two senior building physics consultants, Sarah Price and Tim Wilcoxon. They're working for a company called Quoda Consulting, which used to be Inhabit, which is maybe what a lot of you will be familiar with. That's been rebranded. I think, Sarah, was that that's in the last 3 months you've changed the name?
We merged at Christmas.
Merged at Christmas, right? Yeah. Just out of interest, what is Quoda? Where did Quoda come from, if you know?
So Quoda is an MEP, traditionally an MEP consulting company, but they have got more and more into sustainability over the years, and had quite a strong sustainability team before we joined it, and now it's even bigger.
Right. Excellent. Okay. So those of you who've signed on, who've registered, you'll have seen Sarah's sort of biog and history and so on. You won't have seen Tim's. So I won't just sort of repeat that, but I do want to point out that what I like about this team we're about to hear from is that they've clearly got a good understanding of strategic issues, sort of large-scale deployment of energy efficiency. Strategically, they carry out modelling, thermal analysis, economic analysis, but this is informed by feedback from built projects, which is obviously a very important part of how the ACB likes to work. And that's from private and public clients, and includes occupant feedback as well. So this sort of feedback loop, which is informing their work, is very, very powerful. I also like the fact that they're quite practical people, even if it's in their own time. Sarah's done work on her own house, as I believe Tim has. Tim also has some making skills, which is interesting. Furniture, I believe. They have an understanding of key tools, PHPP, Passive House Planning Package, and SAP. They have an architectural understanding of buildings, understanding of older buildings. They obviously understand energy efficiency and how that's applied to buildings of different types, and domestic buildings of different types and constructions. They have an understanding of standards and certification issues, how these sort of various standards are set up, and how they're certified either more or less robustly. And intriguingly, Tim has done a law degree, I believe, and Sarah has done a PhD in molecular physics, both of which intrigue me. So I wanted to ask Tim, what was the law degree about, and what did you do after that?
The law degree was something I did at Bristol University. It was a first degree bachelor, just a general overview of the law for 3 years. But I realized I just wasn't my cup of tea, and I went off to study furniture making and design. And that sent me off on an architectural track eventually, whereby my most recent iteration is to have refurbished and gutted and refurbished a Victorian house, and brought it to close to Enefit. Can't prove it, but close to Enefit standard, with a air tightness of 0.59.
That's right, very good. That is impressive. Yeah, well, you've kind of half proved it. And what about you, Sarah? What's this intriguing molecular physics?
Oh, well, that was a long time ago as well. So I did a PhD in the detection of chemical warfare agents with the MOD, and creating lots of vacuums. So I learned all about air tightness, ultra high vacuums we were creating. But I realised that I didn't want to work for the MOD and wanted to do something completely different after that, more sustainable, and hence it ended up becoming a passive house consultant and going down that route.
All paths lead to passive house consultancy then.
Indeed.
Fantastic. Okay. Well, I'm going to hand over to you, and we're going to be looking at building regulations, the Future Home Standard, and whether the ACB new build standard does or doesn't have an important role to play. I'm really interested to hear your views on that, obviously. Over to you, Sarah.
Great. Thanks, Andy. So we're going to do a bit of a joint effort today. So I will start with a sort of an overview and introduction, and then Tim's going to present some modelling that we've done in-house. So hopefully you can see my screen and the new slides. So we're going to have a look at different types of standards, just to make sure everyone's on the same sort of understanding in terms of sustainability, energy, carbon standards. And I'll go through all of the standards just very briefly, so we know what we're talking about. But the real sort of crux of this talk is, how do these standards compare? And will the ACB building standard still be a useful standard in the future when we come to Future Home? So that's kind of the main question we want to answer today. So there's lots of different ways of measuring sustainability standards. Some of them look at carbon reduction, like building regulations and Future Home Standard. And some of them look at the energy efficiency. So that would be more passive house and ACB building standards. And then, of course, we have sustainability standards that look at a whole raft of different sustainability issues. And that include the home quality mark, which will include some elements of energy efficiency and carbon reduction within them. So the ACB was founded in 1989, and they actually launched the Passive House Trust in 2010. So they brought Passive House to the UK. And their purpose is to deploy environmentally responsible building practices. So the ACB is sort of really looks at the cutting edge of what's going on in buildings, in retrofit, in new build, and making sure that we are doing the very best when it comes to our buildings. They do an awful lot of training. They do loads of things as a membership organisation, obviously, lots of training under the Carbon Light brand. But we also have these standards, ACB building standard, and there's a retrofit standard as well. And it's the building standard that we're interested in today. I'll talk a bit more about that in a second, but there's also some complementary sort of mini standards, if you like, around water, daylighting, and whole life carbon as well, which is the newest one. So it's based on the Passive House Standard, the ACB standard. So originally we used to have different levels, silver and gold, and the gold was replaced by the Passive House Standard, and then the silver became the ACB building standard that we know today. It's got slightly relaxed targets compared with Passive House, so the space heating demand isn't quite as onerous, but there's still quite a good air tightness target. And it's essentially, the rest of it is sort of follows all the rules of Passive House. You use the same modelling tool, PHPP, and you have to make sure that you meet all the Passive House requirements. The other major difference is it's self-certified, so you don't need to go to a third-party certifier like you do with Passive House. You can sign off the certificate yourself. And usually that's done by someone who's a Passive House consultant, but it doesn't necessarily have to be. But it does need to be registered on the Low Energy Building Database, which is one of the largest low energy building databases in the world, we believe. And it's well worth a look on there if you haven't already. All the projects that are certified are there for everybody to see. And the complementary standards, I believe, can be used for both domestic and commercial buildings, but probably best placed for domestic. But we have a water standard that aims to reduce hot water. We have a lifetime carbon standard that uses RIBA challenge methodology, but it uses the Passive House ribbon tool. And we have the daylighting ACB daylight calculator, which use the same calculation procedure as the home quality mark. So ACB and Passive House principles are that we are aiming for low energy bills and comfortable living conditions. We've got possibly southern orientations, but we're making the most of that solar gain without having summertime overheating. We've got high levels of insulation. ideally a thermal bridge free design, or certainly continuous insulation. We've got continuous air tightness, absolutely, so really low levels of air tightness. And in passive house, certainly we have high efficiency heat recovery, MVHR. The ACB is actually slightly flexible. You can have MEV or MVHR, but today we are really focusing on the MVHR side of the ACB standard and the air tightness that goes with that. So the 1.5 air changes that goes with that MVHR. Obviously, it's not all just about space heating. We have to look at everything that goes in the building. So we're talking about regulated and unregulated. And then we've got a quality control process. So in passive house, it's slightly more rigorous. You have obviously this third party independent certifier who checks all of the information that's coming in. And in AECB, you have to bear all and put it all on the internet in order to get your project certified and upload certain types of evidence that's required for the low energy building database. So if there's one thing we know about passive house is that there's no performance gap. We know that they perform. So you may have seen this graph before. It's been used lots of times, but each one of the blue lines is a different building. And we've got 4 different development here in Germany. And what we're interested in is the average sort of energy consumption. We've got little S curves on each of the sites because that is to do with occupant behaviour. So some people like to keep their houses really warm, much warmer than others, and maybe open the windows at the same time, whereas other people like to live in much cooler houses. So we'll always see this S curve. So what we're interested in is the average of that. And what you can see is that it matches the actual energy consumption, matches the PHPP calculation. And that tells us that the buildings are performing as we've designed. There is evidence that AECB buildings are following the same kind of profile. So they've redone this research in the UK for passive house buildings, and their findings are the same. For AECB buildings, it's not yet published, but there is evidence out there that they do also perform. So on the other side of things, we get a lot more out of passive house and AECB because we get superior comfort. So sometimes passive house is known as a comfort and energy standard. And that's simply because you go in a passive house and you don't notice it. You don't notice you have hot head, cold feet or anything like that. You know, it's just perfectly still, it's perfectly quiet, reduces noise pollution because of the air tightness. You've got no temperature gradients, there's no drafts. A really good indoor air quality, so it doesn't feel stuffy. It's not too hot, it's not too cold, so we've got protection from overheating. It's beneficial for allergy sufferers on the health side because we're trying to filter out all of those pollutants from inside and outside of our homes and buildings. And we've got really low energy bills as well. So lots of other benefits from AECB standard. So that takes us on to the future home standard. So let's have a little look at building regulations and where we're going. So this is a diagram taken from the Passive House Trust Demystifying Air Tightness Guide that was written a few years ago. And if you printed this out on an A4 piece of paper, it would give you the actual size of hole to achieve that air tightness for a metre squared of wall or roof or whatever it is you're looking at. So for every metre squared of external envelope, you would have something about that size. So it's relative air leakage. Now for passive house, obviously it's quite small, and ENERFIT is the passive house retrofit standard, a little bit bigger, and then the AECB MVHR sort of air changes 1.5. Building regulations notional building is set at 5 metres cube per metre squared hour, and you can see quite a lot more holes in every metre squared. Now, where are we going with the future home standard? Therein lies the problem. We're not going anywhere with it in terms of air tightness. The suggested future home standard indicates that there's going to be no improvement in air tightness. So what we do see is a dramatic drop in U values. So we are really increasing the amount of insulation we're going to put in our buildings. But is it really dealing with thermal bridges and air tightness? unfortunately not. We're not seeing any improvements in air tightness or any improvements in thermal bridging, and still allows natural ventilation. So actually what we're doing is building really well insulated wind tunnels. So lots and lots of insulation, but it's not continuous. We haven't got good air tightness, we've got natural ventilation, so we're going to be letting a lot of that heat out in other ways. This takes us nicely on to Wolfgang Feist, who was the father of Passive House in Germany. And in the late 1980s, he gave this statement. I was working as a physicist. I read that the construction industry had experimented with adding insulation to new buildings and that energy consumption had failed to reduce. This offended me. It was counter to the basic laws of physics. I knew they must be doing something wrong, so I made it my mission to find out what and to establish what was needed to do it right. Now, I feel this is where we are heading in the UK. So Germany was there 30 years ago, developed Passive House, had a look at all the bits that matter when you get down to low energy buildings, and our future home standard is heading towards this scenario. So some nice graphs for you just to try and illustrate this a bit more. So I've taken the gains off, so just to not confuse us, but if we just look at the losses in this particular archetypes, this is a semi-detached house, just as an example. The blue is the heat losses from walls, roof, floor, windows and doors. So all of the sort of insulated elements, if you like. The red is the heat losses through thermal bridges, and then the green is the heat losses through ventilation. Now this is ventilation and infiltration. So this is the leakiness of the building plus the heat losses lost through natural ventilation. And you can see that our current building regulations, 2021, so this is what we're expecting in June this year, we've got just over sort of 90 kilowatt hours per metre squared. Future home standard, U values are improved, so we can see the blue bit is reducing a little bit, which is what we'd expect to see. However, no improvement in thermal bridging, no improvement in ventilation. ACB standard at 1.5 air changes really improves ventilation. We've got an MVHR as well, so we're recovering heat. We've reduced the thermal bridging. U values are about the same, but you can see that we've almost cut in half the total energy use, heat losses. And then Passive House, again, we're reducing that a little bit further still because it's better air tightness. So you can see that what is left is really concentrating on thermal bridges and ventilation. So I'm going to hand over to Tim, who's going to tell me when he needs his slides changing.
Yeah, great. Thank you, Sarah. Good morning, everybody. So we've been modelling 6 residential archetypes for regional district council in England, and pretty representative of anywhere. And we've developed a series of specifications based on different building standards. And we've tried to apply a level of parity between the Future Home Standard and the ACB Passive House standards. So the ACB and Passive House specifications are actually a reflection of the Future Homes notional building standards as far as we know them. And they're not tied specifically to the ACB or Passive House targets, such as space heating demand. It's really just trying to get that notional parity between the standards. So there are, comparing these standards isn't ideal. Sorry, can you, I forgot to say next. So these are the sort of specifications assumed. We've got the different standards, and you can see next the differences in the specifications are, in fact, in terms of the fabric, they're pretty similar, whether it's Future Homes or ACB or Passive House. And they are remarkably close on that level. However, I would like you to notice the levels of air tightness difference and the type of ventilation system. which we see as the key elements when building future homes. Next. So like all building regulations, Part L building regulations, future homes is rooted in the SAP methodology, and the new SAP 10.2, which will go live in June, alongside the Part L 2021 regulations, will adopt increased cost per kilowatt hour. As we all know, it won't necessarily reflect exactly what we're actually paying. I mean, I've seen already for my home that we're going to be paying about 29-30 pence a kilowatt hour, maybe more. So energy costs are rising fast. But next slide. The fuel carbon emissions, the factors are coming down in SAP 10.2. So the Future Homes Standard has a stated aim of reducing carbon emissions by 75% and promotes electrification. I find it's a rather curious coincidence that the contribution from renewables nationally has been calculated and apparently shows a 73.8% reduction in carbon emissions from electricity since the last evaluation in 2012. By contrast, there's little change. There is little change in the carbon emissions factor for gas, but the electricity reduction is significant. Next. So if we look at just one of these archetypes, we can see that while the building regs in 2030 and 2021 have relatively high CO2 emissions, the Future Home Standard appears to be heading towards a net zero operational targets for 2050 with the aid of PV. This is using the PHPP methodology. And we can see a trend line showing a steady reduction in CO2 emissions via the different standards, as you'd expect, with significant improvements arising from the Fabric First approach. In this example, the Future Home Standard, the ACB and the Passive House all achieve at least an 80% reduction in emissions compared to the 2013 building regs, and so are within the government target to align with net zero by 2050 through the decarbonisation of the national grid. But so the equivalent ACB and PH Classic standards with the building regs level of PV requirement, which is derived from a floor area formula, these cut the carbon emissions by at least half again when compared to the Future Home Standard. And if you take the regulated emissions only, in the blue columns here, which is the SAP approach, regulated emissions, you can demonstrate you're carbon positive. But using PHPP with the total emissions calculations, which are the red columns, the only net zero available to us right now, as an example, is Passive House Plus, with the Future Home Standard having to wait something like 28 years to get there in 2050, assuming the grid is decarbonised. For a climate emergency, that's a long time to wait. So in practical terms of future proofing, retrospective measures for enhancing the performance of future homes building will be more complex if you were to consider, for example, installing ducting for MVHR and ensuring air tightness measures have been implemented. The Future Homes Standard only requires natural or extract ventilation at around 5 air changes an hour, as we've seen, whereas we would recommend the MVHR with a maximum of 1.5 in line with the better ACB standard. Next. So another way to look at this is to start with a fabric first approach, incorporating the MVHR ducting and air tightness that we need, and then add PV retrospectively, taking advantage of future improvements in PV efficiencies to enable minimal CO2 emissions. Something like the new panels that people are talking about, which are based on perovskite, for example, in Oxford. This approach sounds remarkably like the Future Home Standard approach. It reduces long-term retrofit costs and occupant disruption, while at the same time locking in carbon savings for the lifetime of the building. Future-proofing by designing in space for heat pumps and hot water cylinders or cabling for energy storage would be sensible design precautions to ensure the fundamental fabric of a new building doesn't need to be disrupted. However, the Future Home Standard fails to provide the key element in the jigsaw, which is the air tightness of 1.5 or less with an MVHR system. Next. So here we're looking at the space heating demand. We've looked at the downward trend of the CO2 emissions, but the more significant, in my view, startling finding from our analysis is the space heating demand story. Looking at the 6 archetypes again, as you'd expect, the SAP 10.2 software gives us failures on the 2013 building regs, as you'd expect. No surprises there. And the Future Home Standard and Passive House Classic both pass building regs as anticipated, with the Future Homes archetypes achieving net zero in 4 out of the 6 house types. Whereas in the Passive House approach, they're all achieving net zero effectively with SAP 10.2. The N-Terrace only fails by 0.2%, so I'm counting that as being net zero really. If we start to compare the space heating demand results of Future Home Standard with any of the Passive House standards, there is in fact a further 78 to 96% reduction in the heating costs, according to SAP. So from this point of view, we're led to the question, is the Future Home Standard adequate for tackling fuel poverty? Especially in the current fuel and cost of living crisis, is it fair that we build homes to a Future Home Standard that actually costs 75% more to heat than it really should do for a modern home? The cost of constructing an ACB or Passive House Standard home has been shown to be an uplift of about 6 to 8% compared to constructing a Future Home Standard home. But the annual long-term savings in energy bills that the ACB approach can bring will hugely benefit individuals and bring many other positive impacts locally and nationally in ways that more than repay these capital upfront costs. Next slide, please. So the Future Home Standard shows high levels of space heating demand here. You can see, take the N-Terrace, 68 there. ACB 21 kilowatt hours per meter squared per year. So that we've got the same amount of PV on the ACB example as we have on a Future Homes example. And yet on the ACB standard, we can still see a 63 to 77% reduction in space heating costs. And if we were to build it to Passive House Classic standards, we'd be talking about 71 to 86% savings on space heating. So this slide alone, I think, demonstrates why the Passive House approach is important for people living on a low income. And of course, it benefits the country as a whole with more cash available for infrastructure. And we've got an example of Exeter Council where they've had a Passive House approach to building for some years now, And they've shown time and again they've got a better retention of tenants, lower property voids, people pay their bills, there's less stress for tenants and management. So everybody's a winner. Next slide, please. And these are the International Energy Agency report back in 2014 illustrated some of the benefits of this low energy approach. It's really has a very big impact in many areas of our lives. Next slide, please. So when we look at these two approaches, whether it's through the SAP building regs approach or through PHPP, we can see in both cases that there is a dramatic reduction in space heating. What we see with the Future Home Standard is that we can provide a well-insulated wind tunnel, as Sarah has mentioned. But really what we're looking to is get some woolly jumpers with a Gore-Tex wind barrier included if we take the ACB and passive house approach. It's really not complicated. We've just got to get the air tightness sorted out. So SAP tends to focus on the carbon emissions, but as we move to decarbonisation, this focus will become less useful as a metric, and energy usage or energy demand will become the primary question. This is what Letty's arguing for, a more honest approach to our energy needs to inform our energy policies. If we look at the yellow line, which is the detached bungalow, we can imagine that could be occupied by a person on a low income or with a disability or both. That's one injustice we could easily remedy by better air tightness, more robust fabric, and a good ventilation strategy. Space heating is, I think, about social justice in the end. It's not just about saving the planet. And it's what we're trying to do at regional level policy making, somewhere where everyone can afford to be more comfortable, healthier, and warmer. Over to you.
Thank you, Tim. So I'm just going to try and summarise what we've been talking about. I've got a sort of technical stuff slide to start with, which I'll try and talk you through to make sense of some of what we've seen. So we had some interesting questions earlier when we did this to our team internally, and so this is why I thought to put this slide in. But one of the questions was, what is the main difference between PHPP and SAP as a modelling tool? And my response is, well, the main difference is that you have intermittent heating in SAP. I mean, there's other smaller differences as well, but they are fundamentally the same kind of tool. You know, they're both energy modelling tools with similar methodologies. So what you will find in SAP is that as you get down to really low energy buildings, SAP will overestimate, because there's a tendency to the heating will just be on all the time in low energy buildings. They will retain their heat, they retain the temperature, and that's why PHPP assumes that the heating's on all the time. So SAP will overestimate low energy buildings, underestimate. But more importantly, I think is how we measure what a good building is, and that is what Tim touched upon. You know, the fundamental problem with our building regulations is it's driven by CO2 emissions reduction, which gives us a technologically advanced building, you know, lots of solar PV, etc. Now, they have gone some of the way with, you know, improving U values, but it's not the same as a fabric first approach that we see in the ACB standard or the passive house standard, which are driven by heat demand and energy. So that's the left-hand side. So if we go to the right-hand side, so the performance gap, it's kind of the elephant in the room. We didn't really talk about this much in our modelling, and that's because we didn't include it. So you might see some research done by the Passive House Trust who've included performance gap in their modelling, but we haven't. And it is there, it is real. There's debate about how big it is, but you know, there's been reports written on it in the UK. We definitely see the performance gap in our UK building regulations homes, and we don't see it in passive house homes. So we need to take that into account when we're looking at the results that we've shown you as well. And then the last two on the right hand side are about air tightness. Are we building to fail? So the performance of insulation is linked to air tightness. You may have heard of thermal bypass. If air passes in or around insulation, it reduces the effectiveness of it dramatically. And then 80% of building failures are linked to moisture. Air tightness is key to this. So BS 5250, which is the standard for moisture in buildings, has got it right. 2021 update. It says, in new builds, there ought to be, as far as possible, a continuous air barrier, not necessarily a vapour barrier, on the warm side of the building envelope. But what use is having a continuous air barrier if there isn't the air tightness target to back it up, like there is in Passive House and AECB? So that's the technical stuff. But our conclusion from this is that Passive House is the new build standard which we should be aiming for. There is no excuse to build any worse than Passive House. AECB building standard is a stepping stone to this. It takes you down the right path of air tightness, etc., but gives you that little bit of leeway if you've not done it before. It's being adopted by some councils, taking it forward in various parts of the UK. The future home standard might be net zero ready, but it does not take into account fuel poverty, health and comfort. And that, oh, one more slide. Yes, sorry, I've forgotten about this one. I always forget about this one. We did some interviews with contractors, developers and housing associations. This was on behalf of another council, because they asked the question, what is equivalent to Passive House? And the results were 83% said there is no equivalent. And the reason it was only 83% is because the other 17%, they didn't know. They didn't know what, you know, didn't have enough technical knowledge to answer that question. So I think that says a lot really about Passive House, in the fact that there isn't really anything else that is as good as Passive House in terms of performance and Fabric First standard. Thank you very much. That's it from us.
Thanks, both of you.
I think you can be reassured, Andy. There's still a role. There's
Well,
still a role.
the
ACB.
yeah, the ACB standard was originally conceived as a stepping stone. So it's interesting to see that you still feel it has that role. Although the quicker people take that step, the better. You know, the sooner we can retire the ACB standard, the better, I think.
Well, I think it's particularly relevant to retrofit, actually, the ACB.
Yes.
Especially.
Yes, there is a question about retrofit, so we might briefly touch on it. So I'm aware of the time. We've got 20. We normally finish at 1. Sometimes the audience and the presenters are enthusiastic enough just to let it go a little bit longer. We generally try to aim for 1. So we've got 20 minutes, which is actually quite a good time. We've got about 8 to 10 questions, which I will go through. Before that, I just wanted to ask a question about this interlinked, this sort of, you've highlighted ventilation and air tightness as an issue, and you've adopted an option within the ACB new build standard of using MVHR and a tighter level of air tightness. And so I'm going to put several things together here because it's all part of the same question. You're also suggesting that there's an uplift of about 6 to 8, you know, maybe 10% build costs relating to building to either ACB standard or Passive House, because you can make a lot of savings in money from just making a simpler shaped house. You know, it's not all about just a bit more insulation or additional ventilation system. If you get rid of the twiddly bits, you can save thousands, you know, for a developer's design. So we understand that. So what are the first question is, do you think that the option within the ACB new build standard for mechanical extract ventilation and a slightly looser air tightness target is something that should be dropped, or do you think it has a role within this stepping stone idea that you're supporting?
I think it's it's definitely got a role because MVHR is not for everyone. We've seen some real issues with MVHR with some housing associations. But for the most part, it's a really good technology, you know, and keeps people very comfortable. So, I mean, I personally, I would keep the MEV in there, but I think I might say, no, it's all got to be 1.5.
Well,
so
that's
we
interesting
protect
because
our buildings.
we have had a technical group meeting some time ago now, and we did agree, didn't we, that we would tighten up the air tightness to 1.5 for both types of ventilation system, and I have been slightly sitting on that, and one of the reasons is because the uptake of the ACB standard has been popular because of the limit of 3. It has been popular that, and I just, with that sort of feedback, I have been slightly reluctant to implement what the technical group agreed, but I think we should probably revisit that at the moment, and part of it is trying to get feedback. Building is a long-winded process for getting feedback. So, for example, the Isle of Man project, where the Isle of Man government are they've been exploring the adoption of the ACB standard on the Isle of Man, and they are supportive of it, and they are building to it and learning from that. Sarah, is that right? You're involved in some of those Isle of Man projects.
Yeah, absolutely.
And what would you say about this air tightness target? If we'd have had 1.5, would they have gone for it, or is it, you know, is this number, which actually is quite important, isn't it? Because 1.5 is a bit harder to achieve than 3, and there are limits with construction methods, aren't there? You know, if they want to use dot and dab plasterboard or whatever, they don't have the confidence to go beyond. I mean, 5 obviously is in the industry mind. 3 maybe is acceptable, but 1.5 is just too close to that sort of complete regime change. We have to change the way we build. What's your experience from the Isle of Man projects?
Well, I mean, I haven't been that close to the client at the early stages of decisions. Probably a better question for Bill Butcher, to be honest. But I think Julia's just written in the chat, it's all about perception of how difficult it is. 1.5 sounds really hard, whereas 3 doesn't sound too far off. I think rather than focusing on the target, I always tell people that it's about designing a continuous air barrier and using the right products. And if you're doing that, that's kind of the first stepping stone. You know, actually putting an air barrier in a design is a big leap forward from where we are at the moment in building regulations.
And I think
appointing an air tightness champion, I'd say, having somebody who is focused on that aspect on site makes a terrific difference. There's one job I was involved with. There's multiple units, multiple houses, where they had different foremen for different areas, and there were basically the 2 gangs were competing against each other to try and get better air tightness values. You know, Joe would be, he'd be on 3. Oh, we can do much better. We'll do 2.5, and so they start going lower and lower until they can.
Well, this is exactly the sort of culture change needed, isn't it? And it can be fun, as you're implying.
Exactly. Yeah. And then you get prizes for hitting the targets, you know.
Yeah. So there is, to some extent, there is a small quantum jump needed. And if there is a quantum, because it's not just about achieving the air tightness, it's about achieving the air tightness with construction methods where that will last for 100 years. I mean, if these buildings are around for 100 years or more, it can't just be silicon and a bit of tape that just gets through the air pressure test, and then within a couple of years it's, you know, a bit of DIY and it all goes. So I think maybe that, you know, if there is a quantum jump, then whether it's 3 or 1.5 maybe becomes as critical. So I'm feeling under pressure that we should probably make that decision and maybe now tighten it up.
Well, it should be better than the retrofit standard, arguably.
Yes, well, exactly. We've gone ahead with the retrofit standard, haven't we? Although we can touch on that issue maybe if we've got time. Okay, so there's a few questions. I'm going to get the kind of simpler ones out the way first. So are these slides, so this webinar can be watched again by ACB members. Are the slides able to be shared, or are they not?
I don't see why not. I think we can we share them, Tim?
I have no problem with that.
Yeah.
Okay, well, if you don't have a problem, then Sam, what we could do is we could make them available as a PDF and send them to all attendees.
Fine.
Okay, that's very generous, thank you. Other simple question, just confirmation that the Code for Sustainable Homes was axed. I think that it's still referred to, was it 2015, wasn't it? It's still referred to, is it by local authorities in some?
I don't think there's much out there now that refers to. I'm not sure. Tim did a lot of policy research.
There might be the odd backwater that hasn't kept up.
Progressive backwaters. Okay.
May want to still refer to that, but I think people are moving to the higher standards generally, and certainly planners are now getting much more switched on. In sort of in light of having climate change action plans and emergencies declared and all this sort of stuff, it's made them focus a lot more on this agenda and how do they improve their energy supplies and make them more secure. So many issues, really.
Yeah. Okay, Margaret Reynolds is asking, she says that we understand the ACB retrofit standard for air tightness is 2 air changes per hour. Is this the main difference between the retrofit standard and the ACB building standards? Do you want to answer that, Sarah? You're pretty familiar with the ACB standard as it's currently framed.
There's a lot more to the retrofit standard because there's a lot of risk in retrofit, and the standard is written to recognise that. So it's all about getting a really good survey of the building in the first place, and that's got to be submitted as part of the evidence. So know your building, but then also identify the risks in your existing building, and they're around moisture and flood and fire and radon and overheating, I think, are the 5 major risks. So that you have to write a report around those, whereas the new build standard just focuses more on the on the energy side of things. It just follows Passive House.
New build theoretically should be de-risked in a way that adopting an existing building with all its problems is not. The other difference, of course, the space heat demand target for the full ACB retrofit is 50 to 100 with exemptions, because there are lots of good reasons, if well argued, why you can't achieve a space heat demand of 50. Just as a heads up to the audience, we are looking at extending the ACB standard to allow a much lighter approach to the building fabric when combined with a heat pump. I'll be doing modelling to look at that. The concept is that although a sort of light fabric and a heat pump retrofit makes some very good greenhouse gas emissions, very significant greenhouse gas emissions, there are issues of running costs and fuel poverty and all the other non-energy co-benefits, which will probably become increasingly important in time. Means that we would not allow certification of that type of retrofit unless there's a whole house plan in place, and the subsequent deeper retrofit must not be blocked for the building's lifetime. So that's something that, if you keep an eye on what we're up to over the next few months, you'll see some action on that front. Francis Cricker said, will SAP 10.2 not be updated with more realistic energy costs when before release? Tim?
Yeah, I don't think it's we really know at the moment. Judging from past performance, I suspect they'll probably just stick to the figures they've got right now, and then it'll be out of date before it's even printed, like 2012 was. But you know, it's a guide. It's never been claimed to be an absolute reflection of of the real world. It's a relative measure.
Yeah, okay, thanks. Cara is asking, what is Passive House Plus, please?
So the idea behind Passive House Plus is that it's supposed to meet net zero. So Passive House Plus, it just has all the same requirements as Passive House, except that you are generating with PV. as well, and there's some generation requirements to meet that.
So the amount of photovoltaics will cover the running costs of your house. Effectively, they cancel each other out.
But there is something, isn't there, about the seasonality of the primary energy renewables target does have a quite important conceptual difference because it factors in the issues of storage. Do you, either of you, feel you can summarize what's interesting about that?
It's probably easier with a diagram, to be honest. It's quite a difficult concept, but yes, it's around this idea that although you maybe have, I don't know, heat pump at 250% efficient, you are still going to have some losses in the whole wider system because of storage, and that's interseasonal storage, but also battery storage, you know, from day to night, etc. So if we have renewables, we're going to need more storage, and so there will be some losses.
Yeah. So not all energy is useful because it's not available at the right time, and it decreases the overall system efficiency with the grid and the infrastructure and the building itself. Exactly. So it's a clever approach, I think, isn't it? We, within the Passive House community, we feel it is a good approach. Okay. Right, so Linda is asking, she's noted that we concentrate a lot on space heating, but not cooling demand, which she said potentially higher for super insulated homes. Can you explain the considerations taken to exclude the cooling aspect in this analysis?
Well, I think I have to disagree. It's not potentially higher for super insulated homes. What you'll find is that as you super insulate a home, the same amount of solar gain will have a bigger impact on the overheating. But in the UK, we actually find that our cooling demands are very tiny compared with our heating demands. So there's still only a very, very small proportion of the total annual energy use of a building. And also, if we're designing sensitively super insulated buildings, following a passive house approach or ACB approach, then we design in shading, we design architectural features. I mean, we don't get that solar gain in the summer, so we don't have to deal with it as much. That's not to say passive house is magic and, you know, it never overheats, and, you know, sometimes it does get too hot outside, but it's very small in our experience, the cooling demand compared to heating.
Okay, this is obviously maybe a webinar on overheating design in both retrofit and new build would make a good separate webinar, I think, actually. Cara's asked again, does the PHPP calculation include embodied carbon? I'll ask that. PHPP per se doesn't, but the ACB plugin PH ribbon does allow you to calculate embodied carbon and lifetime carbon, and in fact sort of customized versions of that is what the ACB team used behind the scenes to try to explore some of these changes to our standards and understanding retrofit standards. We're certainly factoring in lifetime carbon and cumulative carbon with an eye on personal carbon budgets and how much of that is taken up with space heating and cooling. Okay. Colin says, why do you think the Future Home Standard doesn't include an improvement in air tightness? Do you know the background to this missed opportunity?
Can't be specific, but we suspect that large building companies putting quite a lot of pressure on central government to not make the standards too onerous, and they feel that maybe they haven't got quite the skills to address the question of air tightness. It's an industry-wide issue, I think. I do think that there are some of the large companies, volume builders, are trying to grasp the nettle and design in air tightness in some of the modular approaches. But it's by no means universal at the moment.
Do you think it's this question of the quantum jump of air tightness combined with ventilation? If you stay on the right side of 5, you know, you don't have to start investing in that whole, you know, the scary new technology of MVHR and the cost, the capital cost.
There's all of those things. So there's also, I think, potentially there's almost like a product guarantee issue of you know, if we don't hit this air tightness target, are we going to be sued by our investors or the end of the line owner of this property? they're going to say, well, look, you haven't provided what it says on the tin.
Doesn't seem to be a problem for missing insulation, does it?
No, it doesn't. But air tightness somehow, because it's a quality control issue, isn't it? Air tightness. When you do the air test, you're somehow proving that the building is performing in a certain way. And if it doesn't, a lot of head scratching goes on as to how do we remedy this among builders, I think. So they're a bit frightened of it.
I think it is increasingly. I mean, you know, air tightness is where we started out as being very important. Then certainly in my mind, we felt we sort of cracked it a bit and our attention wandered away from it. But it's very much with retrofit and this new build come back to focus on air tightness, particularly when the sort of build methods that you know, with new build, how do you go back and improve an air tightness down to where we're going to have these buildings? It's incredibly frustrating when layers of construction have been put in place and you really have to take stuff apart to get to improve it. Now is the time, isn't it? I think more stick and less carrot in this area.
Yeah, I think our building regulations, they also point to an airtight building envelope, you know, in lots of places, but we just don't do it and we don't know how to do it. And I think it's not just contractors we focus on here. I mean, designers as well. Many architects won't know how to design an air barrier or even what an air barrier is. So I think it's fundamental sort of change in the whole industry.
It is. And of course, with so many different combinations of construction methods, the problem appears to be bigger. If we just had very simple construction methods being used for new buildings, we would be able to focus and come up with some pretty cost-effective solutions, I think. Yeah. So Rob Bayliss has said, Sarah mentioned that SAP models work on the basis of intermittent heating, whereas PHPP models on the basis of continuous heating. This implies that continuous heating is preferable. Why is that?
I think it's more to do with the way that a passive house building or a low energy building reacts when you heat it. So when you have a building that loses a lot of heat very quickly, you put the heating on for 2 hours in the morning, just when you need to get up and it's nice and warm. And then when you go out for work, it drops off and the temperature of the building drops right down as well. And the same overnight, you know, if you heat it up in the evening, it goes down overnight. With a passive house, you might heat it up, I don't know, for half an hour. It'll get to the temperature it needs to, and it'll stay at that temperature for the rest of the day. And then it might drop a degree in the evening, in which case you just put a little top up in and it will stay at that temperature then for the next X hours. So it doesn't react in the same way, which is why you don't see intermittent heating. I mean, you probably will still have a little bit of on and off, but the point is you're trying to keep that temperature all the time.
Okay, thanks. There's a question from Sam, again, coming back to this MEV versus MVHR. Sam's in support of MVHR as being the aim, ideally being the aim. He says, if you're going to the trouble of retrofitting an MEV system, then you may as well fit the supply duct too, surely. I mean, I think what sort of situation, come back to my earlier question, what sort of house types or situations might an MEV actually be more sensible than MVHR? Is it a very small house, for example, you know, a small social housing development with a small floor plan, or are there other situations where we should be fairly relaxed about new build having MEV versus the double ducted MVHR?
I think it's probably in tenanted situations where somebody who's living in a house is not bought into the MVHR system. It needs regular maintenance, you know, needs filter changing every 3 to 6 months. And if you as a landlord have to do that, you need to access that property every 3 to 6 months, which can be very challenging. And then you can end up with a system that is not working as it's supposed to, is not supplying ventilation as it's supposed to. And in which case, you go, well, MEV is probably more sensible because you don't need to change the filters. So it depends on who's going to be in the houses and how bought in they are to the MVHR approach.
So you don't think that MEV, I mean, MEV is basically a small unit, which could be as low cost as, you know, 300 quid to buy the unit. Depending on the layout of the rooms, there could be minimal ductwork because it's extract only. You do need trickle vents or through the wall vents. to consistently pull air across the rooms. And on some building types, particularly if the air tightness is not so good, it could stop working potentially, where you get the stack effect of air escaping, you know, of the buoyancy of air creating a draw which is working in direct opposition to an MEV, trying to draw air through the. So, you know, that's not a sort of silver bullet either, is it? MEV.
It depends on the systems. I think there's a lot of good newer systems coming out that are demand controlled MEV, and they're constant pressure, you know, so they are trying to provide the right amount of air at all times, independent of stack effect and wind effect, etc.
Right. That's interesting.
I think there is a difference in the type of systems that are coming out now. Continuous systems are a lot better than they used to be.
Another webinar then. That sounds interesting. Okay. Alex Clifford says, and in fact, we're down to the last 3 or 4 questions. So would you mind just staying on for another 5 or 10 minutes? Or
No
do you
problem.
need to? Okay, fantastic. Thank you.
I have to leave at 1:15, but yeah.
Oh, we'll definitely wrap up. Definitely wrap up by then. I think the questions have tailed off now. How do ACB standards for new build and retrofit fit in with the LETI standard? Well, should we just treat the one for new build, since that's the topic of this? How do ACB standards for new build fit in with the LETI standards? Are they basically the same thing, and do we need both?
Mm-hmm. Tim, can you answer that?
There's a lot of detail, isn't there?
There is, yeah.
I'm not sure I could answer it very succinctly.
What about the principle of having multiple standards? Is that useful for the industry for everyone, and to come up with a standard and offer that as a alternative?
Probably 2 or 3 is, you know, then at least people feel that they have choice. And the thing about the ACB standards, I suppose, is there's a lot of helpful people and members who can also help out. LETI is a voluntary organisation, and you have to interpret their literature, which is excellent. It's really, really good, but you won't necessarily have a helpful membership to get you through some issues.
I think
yes.
Also it's not a sort of methodology or a process, the LETI targets, like the ACB or Passive House standards are. You know, they give you the tools in order to get to those LETI targets if you wanted to.
Okay, thanks. I'm not going to I don't think we should answer the what does the panel think of Energiesprong, because it's a retrofit related question, and although it's an interesting question, yeah. I think we'll have to leave that one, unfortunately. Sorry, Nigel. How do the different standards that we've been looking at compare for overheating risk?
That's an interesting one.
Well, in our modelling, overheating wasn't really an issue, actually, oddly.
What you tend to find is we were modelling existing homes, which tend to have quite small windows. You know,
existing designs, you mean?
So existing designs, yeah, sorry. So new build, existing designs, they have quite small windows. And what you find is that actually the overheating is quite low, because you just don't have the solar gains that you would in a sort of maybe a more modern design, I suppose, with larger windows.
Okay. Final question. This is a London-based question. It says, the Greater London Authority London Plan Policy S12, or is it SI2, requires major schemes to achieve 35% improvement against Part L 2021. Where does that target bring us to compared to future homes and passive house standards? I would like to understand how far the 35% improvement is from delivering net zero carbon.
Quite a way off, but I think Tim's probably better.
It's a long way off. This sounds like Richmond, because I came across this requirement recently. Well, as we've seen, I think the Future Homes Standard is trying to achieve a 75% improvement, not against Part L, 21. I mean, that's against the 2012 Part L. So I'm not sure completely what the 35% improvement against the 2021 Part L is.
Fair enough.
But I would say it's probably, it sounds as if it equates closer to pH standard. Yeah.
But what we've got to remember is that we're talking about regulated only here, most probably,
Indeed.
because
Yeah.
building regs does not include
Yeah.
unregulated energy.
Okay. Well, it's fair enough to say you don't understand, because, you know, these things need attention to detail. And okay. Right. Well, got through the questions. That was an excellent presentation, as people have been saying in the chat Q&A. So thanks both of you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
And
Thank you.
are right in thinking we may be rerunning this webinar, or you might be developing it going forward?
Yeah, I think we'd like to rerun it. I think it could be relevant to quite a lot of people, and whether that's with the ACB or with CODA. Watch this space.
Yeah. Okay. Well, we'll let people know. Okay. Well, thank you, everybody. There's lots of positive comments in saying thank you to you guys. So let's.
Thank you very much.
Can I have some lunch?
Thanks.
Okay. Thanks. Bye, everyone.
Thanks a lot. Bye-bye.
Bye.